Hey there, this is Kevin from MaximizingEcommerce.com. I'm broadcasting to you live from my garage as I prepare for busy selling season as we're, sorry about that, getting ready here for the holidays. Oh, again, I've got to learn how to hold a camera one day, slash my phone slash camera. Anyway, enough of me rambling. Really wanted to talk in this particular video about selling internationally. There's been a lot of talk about selling internationally. I just want to share my personal experiences. I sell here in the United States, sell also in Canada and in the UK, in Germany, started making some sales trickle in France, and just added Italy and Spain, which completes the Amazon marketplaces in Europe. So up and running, wanted to share some of my experiences because a lot of times people think, is it worth it selling internationally? And for me personally, it definitely has been. It's been a good chunk of my overall business. Now, one question that I get quite a bit as far as selling internationally is, where should I start? And that's one question people ask quite a bit. So first off, look at where you're at. So if you have a business up and running, I would probably look to whatever country is close to you. Ideally one that's in the same language. Especially if you're selling on Amazon, try to stick with other Amazon marketplaces. And the big suggestion with selling in Amazon, so for example, I'm in the US, my next stop after I sold in the US was selling in Canada. It was pretty easy because the laws are pretty similar geographically, they're right next to each other. Whereas, going to like Germany would be more difficult because it's, across the pond, so to speak. And also in Germany, you have to deal with the language. Now, let's say you haven't started yet at all. My biggest suggestion is just start with where you're at. So first off, I would suggest starting on Amazon. Now, if there's an Amazon marketplace where you live, start there. So for example, if you live in Canada, just sell in the Canadian marketplace. Now, you can very quickly add the US to it, but you're going to learn a lot just getting in there. And there's a lot less complexity, especially when you're first starting. If you already have a good idea of how the tax laws work, how the customs and the culture of the people and the language and all that fun stuff. So I would stay in your home country at first. Now, then, again, branch off to someplace nearby you. So like for me, when I went to Canada, I've been in Canada for a little over a year now. And in that same time period, I've done about almost 15% of my sales in the US I've done in Canada. In fact, it's probably a little bit less than that when you average it out, but it's getting to be closer in the 15 to 20% range lately. Canada has really done pretty well for me personally, at least the products that I have. So some things to consider when you're going internationally is there's just more complexity you have to deal with. But the way I like to think about complexity is a little more complexity means it's going to make it that much harder for someone else to do the same thing. Because a lot of people won't take the extra step. So, having grown up in Dallas, there's a very famous quarterback that used to play for the Dallas Cowboys named Roger Staubach, and one of his famous quotes was, there are no, I lost my train of thought there for a second. There are no traffic jams on the extra mile. I'm glad I got that out there. But it's so true. I mean, if you think about it, people want to kind of go with whatever the easy route is. Now, if you're watching this video, I'm sure you're watching other videos out there too, and you're trying to do the best to grow your business, and I commend you for that. So if you're thinking about going internationally, it's a nice way to do something else that's going to be harder for other people to replicate, and it gives you an extra step on the competition because you are going to have to deal with different currency. You're going to have to deal with different laws, and that can scare a lot of people off. You know what? Let them. You're going to be the one that's going to say, you know what? I'm going to learn it's really not all that much difficult, because the psychology of what makes people buy is pretty similar. Well, I mean, it's actually, we're all wired the same. It's just maybe the customs might be a little bit different, how people look at different products. But I mean, I can tell you, I use this pretty much almost the exact same listings with the descriptions in the US, the UK, and Canada. Very minor tweaks here and there. But, the big things that are different are going to be more the fact that, again, the currency and the tax laws. So let's just touch on that here a little bit. So All right, so let's say you're in Canada, which going from the US is the easiest one to go to next, because then you start getting your feet wet with selling internationally. Well, you have to contend with, just like we have the IRS here in the United States, the Internal Revenue Service, they have the Canadian Revenue Agency, which they call the CRA. And CRA handles a lot of things, and in some ways they make it kind of easier because their sales tax, which they call GST, is all regulated through the CRA. So you would file with them directly, and especially when you're first starting out, you only have to file like once a year. And you just tell Amazon, start charging for GST, and then they add it onto the bill for people in Canada, just like in the US. If you said that you were registered for sales tax in Texas, they would add on sales tax for Texas residents. It's very similar. So basically you get that money, and then you just, when you go to file, you just pay the Canadian government. It's pretty simple. So don't get too hung up on that. In fact, I find it to be simpler than dealing with sales tax in the US, because you have one entity you're dealing with as opposed to all these different state departments of revenue. And I'm not even going to get into, a lot of times people have debate about in the US whether or not they have to be in certain states. Well, we're not going to touch that on here. But on the international part, we're really talking about how when you go into other into other countries, there are going to be some importation laws, and sometimes people get real hung up on this concept of going across the border, that there's going to be custom duties and forms and whatnot, and just all of a sudden they freeze up and say, you know what, I'm just going to figure out a way to make more sales in wherever I'm at, say the US or the UK or whatever. Again, finding just a tiny thing that if you just figure out what is it I have to do to overcome that small obstacle, which is really not that hard, you're going to figure it out. So I remember the first time I shipped stuff from here in Florida to Brampton, Ontario, which is where one of Amazon's warehouses is in Canada, because I was doing fulfillment by Amazon. So they're just like they are in the United States, taking my product from their warehouses and shipping it out to customers that purchase on their platform. They're sending it out to people in Canada that purchase something. And, I didn't have all the right forms done. Well, guess what? I had gone through UPS. They called me. They said, hey, you need this form. We need you to fill out this contract so that we can pay custom brokerage duties on your behalf. Great. So they brokered the customs, and there's certain things you have to pay at the border. You know what? So just get it out there. Just get it out there. Just do it. The universe will reward you for taking action. So as long as you're doing things in the spirit of trying to work within the law, if you miss something here or there, as long as you're not willfully trying to go around the rules, I've found the world typically wants to work with you. Like if you think about it, in Canada, they want to do business with people in other countries, just like you want to do business with their customers. And on Amazon, they've got a lot of great resources of going into other countries, what those rules and regulations that you have to contend with are. So once you get across the border, you're there. And guess what? When you go to another country, maybe the population is different. So like sometimes people say, well, is it worth going to Canada, for example, because the population is only 10% of the US? I say yes, because here's something to think about. So the population is 10% of the US. That's taking whatever your population of the US, people that could be your market, like on Amazon.com, for example, and now all of a sudden you have another 10% of people, because they wouldn't have bought on Amazon.com, they would have bought on Amazon.ca, and you wouldn't have access to them if you didn't go international. So by going international, you're giving yourself that opportunity to capitalize on that 10% of customers. Well, it's only 10%. Well, you're not finding new products. I mean, I guess you could if you thought something was going to sell better in Canada, but if you're a private labeler like I am, you could just take whatever products you have that you're selling to the US market and you could sell to people in Canada. And then you can take those same products and sell them to people in the UK. And then you can translate those listings and sell it to them in Germany. Once you start figuring out how to do it, it gets easier every single time. It's just, there's more complexity and little things you got to worry about. Now, sometimes people think about like, okay, well, the currency is different. What do I have to consider about that? I wouldn't worry too much about that. It's more about the pricing, just making sure that you have good pricing, that you're not going to put yourself in a position where you're losing money. But generally speaking, like when you think about the Western countries that Amazon is in, the currencies are all relatively stable. It's not like you're going to wake up one day and one all of a sudden is going to be 100 times different than it was the day before, and it could totally throw everything off. I mean, it's like little fluctuations here or there that really aren't going to break the bank, in my experience. That's what, knock on wood, I've seen so far. But if it really changes, I'll just have to deal with it. But one thing to keep in mind is, like, for example, in Canada, it's about, for every US dollar, about 1.3 Canadian dollars, or roughly, it fluctuates a little bit here and there, but just roughly as a rule of thumb, for every Canadian dollar, it's about 75 cents US. So that means I'd have to bump up my pricing proportionally. Now, one thing I found is the fulfillment fees, even adjusting for the currency, tends to be a little bit higher. But people actually are willing to pay more in Canada, and that's something a friend of mine who used to live in Canada shared with me at one point in time, and I found that to be the case. And comparing notes with other sellers who sell in Canada, it seems to be the case too. It's just, I think things are more expensive in Canada, and people are willing to pay slightly higher prices. Not price gouging them, but, you know, whatever that, you know, difference in threshold, and then maybe add like an extra dollar, Canadian dollar, for example. So then what's going to happen is you sell it, and just like in the US, they subtract their fulfillment fees. You can have them subtract out your cost of advertising, which in foreign markets, I would definitely suggest you do. If you do any sort of advertising, have them take it off before they then put it into your US bank account. Because you do lose a little bit on the exchange, but don't get too caught up in that. Because again, whatever you make is extra. So if you did all the hard work to identify a product, and now you take that product and you take it somewhere else and you get 10% more sales, you're not really doing all that much more work, other than maybe having to file every so often for GST, just kind of check maybe if you're doing paid ads, just to make sure those are working. But it pretty much is an extra 10% sales just on its own. So if you're considering going international, I would definitely consider doing it. Right now, the competition's much less in international platforms, both in Europe and in Canada. Next year, I'm looking to go in Japan. So hopefully you found this video helpful. If you have any questions or thoughts on where you want to go international, please leave them in the comments down below. And don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube, and we'll share more videos like this. So hope you're doing well. Take care. Bye-bye.